Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. I'll make it quick. We gratefully receive support for the show at Subscribestar, which you can find in the video description, how to support us there. Most people donate $5 a month, but thanks to some recent subscribers, it keeps adding up. So really appreciate it. Okay, well, this is a topic that Black Horse and I have been talking about tackling for a while. And this is really going to be a part one. Academic Agent was just saying, be careful about talking about part one, part two, part three, because you just start to lose audience as you get into your later parts. So the titles will not say part two or three or whatever, but we're going to come at this story over a couple episodes in the coming months. And that's the story of what's going on with Europe economically. Now, I do want to mention, just program note before I bring my co-hosts on, I have my annual family vacation the next 3 weeks, so there'll be nothing, unless something really hot comes up. I am mostly going to be kind of in and out of town and stuff over the next 3 weeks. So channel will take its yearly break, but I hope you enjoy the show today. All right. We have Black Horse and Mad Merc. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Very good. And Mad Merc back with us again. Wait, how many weeks in a row is this? This is exciting.
It'll be 3 weeks in a row at this point.
3 weeks in a row. Rock and roll.
Pleasure to be on with you, gentlemen.
I did feel a slight sadness that I was going on vacation just when we were starting to get you with us regularly again. But hopefully you can pick back up with us in about a month.
Well, you've got a co-host that actually stays with you every week instead of, me who disappears. So
right. The alternate week co-host. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna any introductory comments, Black Horse, before we get right into some charts and graphs and stuff to frame the overall story we want to tell here.
Yeah, so let's talk about the broad story, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about today. So over the last 15 years or so, it's become obvious that the European Union economies are in relative decline when compared to the United States. We've talked about this in the context of the deindustrialization of certain of those economies in the last couple of years. But as we started to dig at this and talk about this behind the curtains here, this is actually part of a much longer trend. And so we wanted to cover some of the staple events of this trend, one of which is the European debt crisis of 2010. And when I mentioned the European debt crisis of 2010 to a number of people, both Radlib and elsewhere, these people had no idea what I was talking about, which led me to believe that this is a kind of an important event to cover because, if you were outside of the financial bubble in that period, you probably didn't really follow it at all.
Well, so we would have heard something, right? Wasn't there something about Greece defaulting or austerity in Greece or something like that? Am I thinking of the right episode?
Yeah, I mean, Greece was the story that kept on giving because they were on either in or out of or on the edge of default continuously for 5 years. But Greece is not the whole story of the European debt crisis,
right?
Which is like a huge bond market story, but I suppose the general public doesn't really follow bond market stories. So,
And this story was always tied up in EU politics, and in specific Germany, France, and the United Kingdom deciding whether they would, step into this situation. And I think we'll get into this story as we progress forward.
But I wanted to contextualize this as one of these long-term structural systemic problems that is contributing to this sort of long-term underperformance of European economies relative to the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now you word that carefully. So it sounds like you wouldn't go so far as to say that Europe's getting poorer in absolute terms. Am I reading too much into how you're wording it there?
I mean, Europe is a big place. There are definitely places there that have gotten poorer in absolute terms. But the European debt crisis is not like a hard collapse the way you might look at, say, the Turkish economy of the last couple of years. It's much more of a like secular stagnation kind of story.
Right. So it's not everyone starving in the streets. It's the first world keeps on marching forward, and countries that we thought of as more or less part of the first world or something are gently falling behind as basically the United States marches forward, right?
Yeah, basically it's Europeans quote first. It's the United States' quote first world allies gradually getting poorer.
Yeah, they're becoming the 1.5 world or something, right?
Yeah.
Drifting into the backdraft a little bit. Yeah, go ahead, Medmer.
I heard a great phrase of this one time. He said, "Drifting back into their natural place in history." Was how I heard it described.
Well, it depends on which history you're talking about, right? Europe was absolutely dominant for hundreds of years there, globally, and what we're pointing at, and this could turn around, right, Black Horse, but just speaking of what we're seeing for right now, we do not see a rising Europe heading back to some kind of globally dominant position. Instead, you're telling a story of a gentle receding from being at the forefront, economically at least. But
yeah, I mean, this is an economic story.
But let's face it, economics is not completely disconnected from things like political power in the world, right? Very poor countries don't tend to be very effective on the world stage.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll kind of unpack the implications of the story as we go along, but it's I don't know. It's a very interesting one.
Okay, so one last thing before we bring up the first chart, which is my mind went right away to our series. Oh, I need to bring that up to share. Our series on the 2008 financial crisis, where we focused very much on the United States, and we didn't really talk hardly at all, as I recall, about even Canada, much less the continent. It was very much a U.S. story. So what is the connection, if any, of 2008, 2007, 2008, 2009 in the U.S. with a recession? Well, first of all, was there a recession in Europe? And does that have anything to do with the 2010, the debt crisis in Europe that starts in 2010?
So there was a very severe recession after 2008 in Europe. There were more bank failures and more bailouts in Europe than there were in the United States, even on a per economic unit basis. So even like Europe is a bigger economy than the United States. It's got a lot more people in it. But on a per unit basis, the 2008 crisis was actually worse in Europe than it was in North America, which is... we didn't comment a lot on it at the time because I still don't quite understand why that was. The inciting event for the 2008 financial crisis is this mortgage crisis in the United States. You would expect that U.S. banks would be more exposed to that kind of event than European banks were, but the net result is that more and a larger percentage of European banks end up failing and end up like semi-nationalized than American banks. So like we talked about this when we talked about Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse, but there were also Royal Bank of Scotland was also a massive bail-in, and I never really got publicly floated again. So there's UBS is another one which recently acquired Credit Suisse that had a major league bail-in during the 2008 crisis. I'm not my expertise in the European banking system is substantially less deep than it is in North America, which is why we didn't talk about it a lot. But it was a severe event there. But the European debt crisis of 2010 is not a direct continuation of the 2008 crisis.
Okay.
That is to say, the events in 2010 are classic government bond crises, which are often incited by a recession, but the specific nature of the recession in 2010 actually probably, or in 2008, actually probably reduce the severity of the crises in Southern Europe rather than increase them, because the response that the Fed and the ECB and everybody else took to 2008 was to reduce interest rates to virtually zero, which relieved some of the pressure on these economies rather than inflamed it. So European debt crisis probably would have been worse if the specific nature of the 2008 recession was different.
But the recession might have been a bit of a trigger as well.
The recession absolutely was a bit of a trigger. A bunch of the economies involved here are tourist economies. When there's a severe recession,
I see.
These tend to suffer a bit. So there's definitely some connection. But if the inciting event had been different, so instead of a banking crisis leading to 0% interest rate, maybe it was an industrial crisis or something, it might have been even worse for the Southern European economies when the triggering event hit the debt crisis.
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to bring up our first chart, and before we do anything else, just help us understand what in the heck we're seeing here. So on the vertical axis, we have percentages. What do those percentages mean, and is it good or bad when your percentage goes up for your country?
Right. So this is just a bond yields chart.
Okay.
With economies in the Eurozone listed here, with some major events in the history of the EU just charted out. The purpose of showing this chart is just to kind of establish the nature of the government debt crisis here. So when you're looking at government bond yields, you're looking at spread over reference yield. So a bond that has a high spread over reference yield, something like a US or German bond, is a bond where the issuer, in this case, the European government in question, is having to pay a large premium in order to borrow. So if you look at the very beginning of that chart, you'll see Greek bonds carry this yield of, between 15 and 25% over the sort of reference German and UK bonds that are between sort of 10 and 5% over the period of in question. So that premium reflects a perception of risk of default. So right, wrong, or indifferent, it's telling you that investors think that there's a risk of a Greek default in the period, and because they perceive a risk of a Greek default in the period, they're asking to be paid a lot more to lend to the Greek government.
So if you're someone who buys Greek bonds and they actually pay off, then you can make bank here, right?
Yeah, there's a whole.
But it's a highly risky venture to buy a bunch of Greek bonds around this time, I guess.
Well, and in the period in the early 90s, you got a big return in terms of yield, but you got it in inflated drachmas, I guess, was the currency at the time.
Yeah.
And so this is the normal course. Bond yields usually have a relationship to inflation. So economies that have a lot of inflation, like Greece did in the early 90s, will have very, very high bond yields in order to compensate investors for the inflation.
Okay, so above a certain reasonable level, a 5%, it looks like, is sort of would something in the 5% plus or minus a few percent would be a reasonable level. If you're well above that, you're in 10-15% high, even higher. This is a red flag. This is a sign that people don't trust this government, I guess, right?
Yeah, it's a sign of fiscal distress for the government.
Fiscal distress for the government, right? But how much is that tied? Being that I still distinguish between state and economy and society to some degree, Uh, uh, how much can you distinguish? Could there be a fiscal crisis without an economic crisis?
Well, so they're typically associated because fiscal crisis is, especially, well, there's layers. First of all, fiscal crises are often precipitated by economic crises because tax receipts go down. So
Right. Yeah.
that's one aspect to it. But the
So
second aspect,
fiscal crisis could be a lagging indicator of economic trouble.
that's right. And in this case, that's kind of what you're looking at. In 08, there's an economic problem. The lagging indicator is the fiscal crisis.
Gotcha.
The other element to it is what governments do in response to the fiscal crisis, because when government bond yields start to go up, the response of governments have problems, and they respond to those problems, sometimes in better ways, sometimes in worse ways. So you get like a whole range of different responses, from confiscatory tax policies to shrinking government relative to the civil society. So it can vary quite wildly what the effect on the actual population is.
Okay, so having established what we're looking at, and that the time period is from 1993 to about 2017.
Well, so the time period for the crisis in question is really late 2009 through about 2015.
Yeah, sorry, I'm describing the overall chart. Yeah. Give me a sec so that people looking on their phone can have some idea of what they're squinting at. So the overall chart is 93 to 2017. The crisis is around 2010, and that 2010 to 2015. That's where you see this giant blue mountain, and that giant blue mountain is Greece. But also, so Greece is a big story, but it's not the only one. A little bit less impressive in terms of the signs of distress here, but also really standing out are Portugal, Italy, Cyprus, and I think Spain is in there.
Spain is in there.
With the colors.
Spain is in there, and so is Ireland, though Ireland is not nearly as severe.
Okay, gotcha. And we may use the media term Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, pigs for short, PIGS. No offense to any of the people in those countries, but that's the common term for these four countries, which are four of the chief ones. Fair enough for them to be called out, right, Black Horse? I mean,
yeah, they're the ones that participated most severely in this crisis.
Yeah. Right. So those four are called out for a reason in that PIGS acronym in this story here. Okay, so having established what we're looking at, wow. Well, first of all, the duration is quite long in my view, Black Horse. This is years and years that this is going on.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting that you see this go on for years and years. You'll also see, for example, on the Spanish line, or I think that's the Spanish line, these large flat periods on the yields where the bonds are non-marketable, and so the data just isn't. We'll get into it as we go through, but you have quite severe interventions in the bond market to try to stabilize these countries. But a key element of the European debt crisis, which is a common theme in the way that the European Union has handled economic crises, is that there isn't like a dramatic moment and then a recovery. There's this sort of therapeutic method applied to make the pain less, but stretch it out over a very long period of time. Which I guess it's a strategy. I guess, I don't know. It's very. I can't imagine it's very much fun to live through. So if we go to the next screen, we'll take an example as a case study.
Okay.
So this is a timeline of the Greek debt crisis in particular, but this might as well be a timeline of all of the debt crises that you're looking at. So on the bottom, the bar chart is GDP growth, and then on the top, you can see that's bond yields, and then it's got all of the different events that occur, both political and in terms of bailouts that occur. And you can see that a key issue here, so we're stretching back into the 09 period, you've got this large negative GDP growth associated with the 08 financial crisis. So if you remember our chart of GDP for the United States, we're looking at negative less than 2% over the period. But for Greece, you get to negative 8%. Now, GDP is kind of a fake number, but negative 8% is ugly. So you're looking at a pretty severe economic slowdown there. That at the early onset of this, and eventually in 2010, after a political change there, you have the first set of movements in bond yields where they move from roughly 5 to roughly 9%. So this is what you would see in like a normal debt crisis. An accelerating kind of hyperbolic shape of chart, and then an intervention to either make the bonds non-marketable or default on the debt. But that's not exactly what you get here. What you get here is the second line here is the first Greek bailout. And what the ECB did is they agreed to buy a large chunk of Greek bonds, not all of the Greek debt, but some significant portion of it, and in exchange extracted political concessions that they felt would improve the fiscal stability of Greece. So the ECB had a set of policies that they thought would help resolve the economic situation in Greece, and you can see that in the coming quarters, these economic reforms certainly didn't lead to growth in the Greek economy. So the reduced spending associated with that was sort of attached to the bailout caused economic declines in Greece that then led to increased probability of default, increased prices for further Greek bonds.
Now, since I don't pay attention to Greece as well as I should have and didn't at the time, I see all these negative GDP shrinkage. We've done a whole show about how you can't totally trust GDP, but ignoring that for a moment, you would say that in this period, 2010 to 2014, it looks like they are really doing badly. I mean, it's not just an illusion of government stats or something. I mean, they are really having severe economic problems for years, right?
When you're putting up like negative 10% quarter on quarter GDP growth, GDP might be a fake number, but it's not that fake.
It's not that fake. Right?
It's not that fake.
There's some underlying reality. Yeah, please, Nedmer.
To jump in here with regards to the EU concessions in the political sense with Greece, if you were following the story at the time, you'll remember that there were a number of candidates in Greek elections during this time that were in the wings and were promising the Greek people to not change any of the pension laws, not change any of basically to renege on all the financial commitments that had been made to the EU post them buying this large amount of debt off the Greeks. And it was very much tied up for a while. It was tied up with Greek internal politics as to which way Greece would turn down, and how they would whether they would renege on the commitments they made to the EU. So there's an added layer there.
The other problem is a substantial portion of the Greek economy is tied up in tourism, and continuous rioting and striking is not good for tourism. So the more that the ECB imposed like pension reform on Greece, the more rioting there was in the street and the less tourists wanted to visit and spend money there. So the one sort of actually productive thing that the Greek economy did, which was service tourism, was really negatively impacted by the reforms that were pushed from the European Union.
And
So,
I'm sorry, the really ignorant question here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, maybe I found something. I'm just not used. I'm not in a country where, as far as I know, tourism represents a major part of our economy, right?
Yeah, in the United States, tourism is like 2 to 5% of your economy, depending on how you count. It's more
Right.
like 15 to 20% in a place
Yeah.
like
So
Spain.
so I pulled this up,
Greece.
and when I Googled, the first thing I saw was 19% of the economy.
Yeah, there's
So
all
that's a
kinds of
really
controversy about
significant.
how you
Yeah.
count, but
Right.
especially for things like, especially in a country with a distressed currency, or with fiscal problems, the injection of capital that comes from tourism is extremely. It's the equivalent of the way that resource prices affect a resource economy like Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So tourists are bringing in harder currency in general, probably. Right. You're getting pounds, you're getting dollars, you're getting euros.
Yeah,
Like
I mean, in this case, one of the so in a typical circumstance, they're bringing in hard currency. The Greek example is very strange because Greece adopted the euro as its currency and so was unable to do what is typically done, which is soft default by inflate the currency.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
Which
this
is
was one of the big debates. This is one of the big debates at the time, was whether Greece would leave the eurozone and return to a national currency in order to do that.
And so all of these conditions associated with the bailouts are all designed to prevent Greece from leaving the eurozone because it's politically, the view in Berlin and in Paris and whatever the other centers of power are for the European Union is that Greece leaving the eurozone and especially the European currency would undermine the project, right? It's kind of like how no country ever voluntarily gives up territory, no matter how unprofitable it is to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes on for a while. So we have between the first Greek bailout and the debt holder write down, we have, I guess, 5 quarters there, so just over a year. So in early 2011, in the face of increasing bond yields and continued economic contraction, there's a negotiated default between of the private holders of Greek bonds and the Greek government. This is extremely controversial because it's a selective default.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not supposed to be legal, but it happens, and it happened in this circumstance.
Okay, so just to make sure everyone's getting it here, people loaned money to the Greek government, and the Greek government said, "Sorry, we're not giving it back to you."
Yeah. So if you were a bondholder that was a private citizen and owned Greek bonds,
mm-hmm.
you would have gotten back, I think it was like 85 cents on the dollar or something like that. So they wrote off part of the debt to private issuers, but did not write off any of the debt held by the ECB as part of the first bailout. Okay.
So it wasn't a full default. It was a partial, or you called it a negotiated default or something like that.
Yeah. So partial defaults are very common.
One might say
bondholders didn't get completely wiped out, but they got a haircut, right?
Yeah, and
one might say it was a managed default.
Yes.
Right.
And bondholder write downs are pretty common. Usually in the corporate context. Usually in the national context, you have your own currency, so you don't write down the bonds, you inflate the currency.
Right.
But if you are in a position like Greece is, where you don't have your own currency to inflate, it's not uncommon to write down the bonds. What's critical here is that they selectively wrote down the bonds held by certain holders. So this is a really big no-no in the investment world, where you have different holders of a security and you treat them differently.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, you should have a court that says, no, you can't do that, and defends the interests of the private bondholders.
Right.
But neither the Greek nor European court was inclined to do so.
Somebody tried, it sounds like.
Well, of
Right.
course, if you got
Yeah.
written down on your debt, you would litigate it too, I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
So
Okay, and this helps greatly, as we can see from the government bond yield spiking up over the next few quarters, right?
well, you can imagine if you were a private investor in bonds, being selectively written down as a private investor might cause you to want to sell your bond holding.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
especially given that the selective write down was not nearly enough to put Greece in a non-deficit situation.
Mhm.
And certainly, you'd be not inclined to buy the next issue of government bonds coming out of the Greek government.
Yeah. So not only did they screw you over, but it didn't even put them in a good position yet.
Yeah, they
So-
didn't screw you over enough to refinance themselves.
Right. So why in the world would you give them money? And the answer from
It's
the Greek government is, we will give you such a high return on this, like
Yeah.
you would not believe it.
yeah,
Yes.
it's a halfway house solution that solved none of their actual problems.
Yeah. So what happens here is you get an extreme spike in bond yields, and then you have the ECB come in again for the second Greek bailout. So very simple. We're going to impose a bunch of conditions on you politically, and we're going to buy a whole crap ton of Greek bonds.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very simple arrangement. Very unpopular in Greece, but very, very simple arrangement.
And isn't this the austerity, what they call austerity?
It's austerity, and then the austerity riots that go with it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for the ECB and the Greek government, they didn't buy enough bonds. So you can see they drove down the bond yields to about 20%. But even after the imposition of further austerity, Greece is still in a deficit position, and its economy is still radically shrinking. So we're still shrinking at like 7% of GDP a quarter, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So we get to not even 6 more months in, and there's another run on Greek bond prices from like 20% to over 30%.
Right.
And the ECB comes out with this statement after, you can see they bailed out somebody else. They bailed out Spain in the meantime. But the ECB comes out and says it will do, quote, whatever it takes to preserve the euro by lowering bond yields.
We will make Europe a desert if we have to, right?
Which is
King
like, if you think about that,
ashes.
if you think about when a politician says we'll do whatever it takes, what that actually means. So they institute this program of consistently buying bonds. So they have the Spanish bailout, they have the Cyprian bailout, and you can see actually that the Spanish bailout relieves the pressure on Greek bond yields, and it does this because it restores investor confidence. So investors become convinced that the ECB will ultimately buy whatever Greek bonds that they have, and so suddenly 25% for a Greek bond seems like a good deal because, maybe I'll get partly written down again, but at least the ECB will buy it, so somebody will buy it.
Yeah.
And so this is how the pressure gradually gets relieved, and so you get a long period here of easing tensions until there's another political change in early 2015, and Greek bond yields start to rise again because they start to deficit spend again, and they start to deficit spend to an extent where it's clear that they deficit spend, they have to float new bonds, and by mid 2015, it becomes clear that another default is imminent, and the ECB program where they'll buy distressed bonds in the eurozone expires in 2015, and so there's some consternation about what's going to happen, and ultimately the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, comes and bails them out.
So what you're saying is that Greece relapses into its old habits and needs and even another institution to come and help them out.
Well, and equally, the ECB decides that for reasons related to the rest of Europe, they don't want to be in the business of buying Greek bonds anymore, and so they find somebody else to bail Greece out instead, which is like there's a whole elite theory discussion there that I'm not qualified to have. Why it is that immediately when the ECB withdraws, the IMF comes in and bails them out, but
right. It looks like a game of hot potato, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to take care of Greece now?
But the point of reviewing all this history is that it is not unique to Greece. You could put up an identical chart here to look at Spain. You could put up an identical chart here to look at Portugal. You could put up an identical chart here to look at Ireland. You could put up an identical chart here to look at Cyprus
and Italy.
And
right? The I is Italy in pigs, right?
Well, typically pigs is spelt with two I's in this context for Ireland.
Oh, it is. I missed that. Ireland and Italy. Okay.
But the Italian one is the Italian, Irish, and Spanish one, and Portuguese ones there are less bailouts. They kind of do it all at once, and Spain is more like this, where they have long periods where the bonds are fundamentally not marketable, and the only buyer and seller of the bonds is the ECB.
Okay, yeah. So what this isn't showing when these bond yields go up so high, what it's not showing is the volume of bonds they're actually selling. And you're saying that don't look at that high price or that high yield and think, wow, people must be really buying that. This must be a fire sale. They must be selling so many bonds with this great yield. That's not necessarily the case, because the high yield is indicating nobody wants to buy the bonds, right?
Well, so in this particular case, because Greece is deficit spending almost continuously through this period, they have to keep selling bonds. The volume is still significant.
Wow.
If you look at the Spanish example, you'll find long, flat lateral periods in the equivalent chart, which represent periods where Spain has been bailed out and the only buyer of their bonds is the ECB. And so because the only buyer of their bonds is the ECB and it's a government versus government transaction, it's a book entry. It's not a real transaction.
Yeah. So you don't see fluctuation.
That's right. So what you see,
it's a price fixed. They pick a fixed price and they just go with it.
That's right. And so what you see in Greece, which makes it a good way to understand this crisis, is a situation where the market stayed active through the entire crisis. So it's easier to follow anyway.
Okay. So shall we go on to bailouts then?
Yeah. So we talked about Greece, but there's a lot of bailouts in this period. And so we've got a pretty wide variety of people bailing European economies out. You've got the IMF, you've got the World Bank, you've got the EIB, the European Investment Bank, I think. Okay. Bilateral means other countries bail them out. I don't know who bailed Cyprus and Ireland out, but somebody. I don't even know who the BOP is. I didn't follow the Hungarian crisis too closely. But they're an Eastern European entity.
Bank of Poland, maybe?
Maybe.
I don't,
I don't know. You have the GLF, which is a European supranational entity that was created during the debt crisis. And then you have the GLF, the EFSM, the EFSF and the ESM are all different iterations of European supranational entities that were created specifically to manage this problem.
So think of them as European central bank creatures of one sort or another.
Yeah, they're creatures of the European Economic Community. And these are all created to figure out who's going to pay for this, to bribe the countries in question to stay in the European currency. And to not default on euro bonds. And all through this period, there's a coordinated campaign in Europe to try to create a single European bond and remarket these bonds instead of at the country level, at the level of the European Union. So to create a European Union bond, which is a general obligation of the ECB, that would then finance the that would then finance these governments at lower rates of interest. The problem with this idea is that you can never, it never quite, it's this structural challenge of the European Union. You've got local governments empowered with taxation and the keeping of law, and you have supranational entities empowered with the management of the currency. And with those two powers separated, it's very, very hard to get coordinated action to manage the economies in ways which are sort of traditional for fiat currency economies. Because, as I say, most countries that have a crisis like this, you just inflate the currency and that's how you pay for the default. But if you're at the level of the European Union, the government that is in crisis doesn't have the power to inflate the currency.
So just going to the total bailout totals, Greece is, why does it say 215 out of 245?
So the $215 billion of it was bailed out by the various entities. 245 billion was written down.
Okay. Gotcha.
So in Greece, there is an actual private investor default, whereas in most of these bailouts, you didn't have a haircut to private. Well, in a lot of these bailouts, you had some private haircut, but in many of them, you had none. So so when it says the IMF took bailed them out for 32.1 billion out of 48 billion, that means they paid 32 billion euros for bonds with a face value of 48 billion, and whoever held the bonds took that haircut.
Oh, okay, I gotcha. Okay, so then I guess focusing on the actual paid out, Greece comes in first at 215. Now they're 216 billion euros. This is tricky because this is for the period 2010 to 2015. Greece shows up again in this chart for a later period. But anyway,
yeah, and an earlier period because they also have a crisis in the 90s.
I don't see.
Oh, it's not on this. So
just Greece 1 and 2 is on the top line, and then there's a Greece 3.
Oh, yes. Okay, fine.
Yeah. Anyway, so 216 billion euros. So by far, Greece is way out ahead. Next one under them is
Portugal.
Portugal during that period. This is
it's Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and then after that,
and then Spain,
and then after that, a bunch of midgets.
Right.
Romania, Hungary, Latvia, etc.
Yeah, and what we're not seeing is, some way to relativize this compared to the economy, right? Because some of these economies are not that big.
Yeah, well, Greece is a standout. Greece and Portugal are real standouts because they're very small economies. The bailouts of Ireland and of Hungary and of Spain are much smaller relative to their economies.
Oh, okay, I see. So Greece and Portugal deserve their top two positions, top two rows on this list.
Yeah.
Not only because of the large amount, but because the economy just wasn't that big, and they're getting so much money thrown at them.
Well, I don't know what the population of Greece is, but 215 billion. This can be a lot for every Greek person, right?
Yeah, right. Per capita,
it's massive. Massive.
Let me just check that actually now. There's only 10 million people in Greece.
Oh my goodness.
So 215 billion, that's like 20,000 euros per every Greek.
Wow. This is insane.
So you're looking at a very, very large bailout. Portugal is also a very, very large bailout there.
Now, it's been a while, and like I said, I didn't pay that much attention at the time, but I recall that part of what happened here is people in like France and Germany started to get pretty upset because they just see themselves as just subsidizing these other countries.
The reason, so when the ECB comes to bail out Greece, there's kind of two results of that set of politics. The first result is they impose a bunch of conditions for the restructuring of the Greek economy, which is where they get all the pension reform stuff. So they say, well, we'll bail you out, but if we bail you out, you got to restructure the way your economy is organized, so that we get paid back on our bailout money. So fair enough. That's one thing that happens. But the other thing that happens is the politics in the sources of the bailout money prevents the bailout from being large enough to actually stabilize the country all at once, which is why the bailout plays out over 4 different events over 5+ years.
Mm-hmm.
So
rather than having a single effective solution that probably would have been hard at the time, due to the politics of both Greece and the wider European area, this dragged out.
Yeah. So it dragged out. It's classic kind of socialize the pain and spread it out kind of methodology.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Anything else to comment here?
No, I think we got a pretty broad picture of what the debt crisis looked like. Pension reform is really at the top of the list, but the other key element that's a condition of these bailouts is reform in the way that taxes are collected. So tax evasion is notoriously a very serious problem in all of the Southern European economies. So at one point, the Greek government imposed a tax on swimming pools because they could be counted from aerial photography. So you could,
which goes back to what there was certain places you find these very small windows or a lack of windows because they tax based on windows, because that's something you could just from the street you could look and see it. And then also something I noticed in the Mediterranean, I asked about it. The interior of a place might be absolutely palatial, marble floors, just beautiful, and the exterior is like old cracking paint.
yeah. So there's this
because of tax
there's this very long tradition in these economies of tax evasion, and as far as I can tell, this issue was never resolved during the European debt crisis. Though they attempted to impose many kinds of conditions to try to root this out. You can imagine in places like Germany and the Netherlands and Sweden, which are all important members of the European Union, voting on this bailout. Tax evasion just doesn't exist in Germany. It just doesn't exist in Sweden.
Right. Rule followers. So, yeah, and they're trying to, I'm just imagining these international bodies coming to Greece and just saying, look, here's all you all need to do to get your people paying taxes. And it's like, okay, Greeks and Italians and so forth have been avoiding taxes for like thousands of years. You don't know what
this is a cultural.
Yeah, it's cultural.
This is a cultural misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So, which kind of gets to one of the things that I think is a fundamental weakness of the euro as a currency unit and as an economic community. You're trying to span over these really, really culturally and economically disparate entities, and the straitjacket of putting them into a body with a single set of regulatory ideas and a single currency managed using a single fiscal is it fiscal? No, it's not fiscal. A single monetary policy really created a pretty serious set of problems for which there's no obvious solution. So, like inside the fiat currency world, the foreign currency market really brings fiscal discipline. But without the foreign currency market, it's much more difficult to manage these kind of crises. So, anyway, so what's the effect of all this besides, some bondholders losing some money and some ugly politics in Europe? Well, it's very difficult to get at this data, but I was able to construct from OECD data a chart looking at the median household in the median quote disposable income. So that's income after taxation of in OECD countries, standardized on the basis of purchasing power parity. So you can see in this chart, first I've got the first line for each country is in local currency. The second line for each of these countries is purchasing power parity adjusted into US dollars. And the third line is what the purchasing power parity effect of that median income is in comparison to a median income in the United States. So in 2005 in Belgium, your median household had disposable income equivalent to 70% of the equivalent American household in terms of purchasing power. Okay, what do you see as a result of this, other than the fact that Europeans are terrible at keeping data in standardized forms? Well, you see that there's quite a bit of, so we'll deal with three different groups of countries. First, the core European Union economies, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, as representatives of sort of the core EU countries. And we see that in the period between 2000 and 2010, they get quite a bit of benefit from the European Union, or at least their purchasing power for their citizens is improving relative to Americans in the period where the European Union is coming together. And this kind of corresponds with a lot of media rhetoric you see about the emergence of the EU as a competitive economic bloc to the United States. You see a lot of enthusiasm for making the EU a quote United States of Europe, that kind of discussion of the EU as like a peer competitor economically to the United States. Then you see in the subsequent years after 2010, the relative decline of incomes in these countries. So you see in Belgium a retracement from, almost 80% of purchasing power parity comparable to the US to 75%. You see a comparable kind of marginal retracement in all of the other core economies. Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, they all look the same. Now we got a different set of countries represented here in Greece and Spain, where we got countries that were active participants in the European debt crisis. And what you see there is just a rapid decline in purchasing power parity for the median household during the period in question. So from as far back as we have comparable data, in each of these cases, you see a continuous decline. So in Greece, from almost 60% to 40%. So, we're looking at marginal declines, but we're looking at substantial declines. In Spain, from 2010 at 70% of the purchasing power of an equivalent American to 55%. So pretty significant marginal retracement. Then you have the last group of countries, which are the quote-based countries in the European Union, Hungary and Poland. And you see in Hungary a pattern that actually looks very similar to the core EU countries, though I suspect it has very different origins, where you see an increase in median income compared to compared to the American experience up until about 2015, and then a retracement from there. And in Poland, you actually see a unidirectional improvement throughout the whole period, which is quite. So you see like a very, very different experience in those countries than either the core European countries, which are seeing this kind of gradual decline after the improvement in 2010, the improvement from 2000 to 2010, and a very different experience in the countries subject to the actual crisis, which you'll see kind of a unilateral decline in household income.
Yeah, it's long running, right? I mean, the last column is 2020, and Greece is it's got the worst number for 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's the decline in median incomes goes on continuously for the low performing countries, goes on continuously through the 20 years covered in this chart. The EU countries don't have data published for 2021, 2022 in mean disposable income in the OECD standard format. So it's hard to measure what's happened since COVID, but in the period running where data is publicly available that is comparable, you see this continuous decline.
Wow. Yeah. So, except for Poland, there's not a lot of good stories here in terms of steady rise in their purchasing power relative to the U.S. In fact, it's only Poland. Everybody else goes down.
Everybody else goes down, yes.
Wow.
And so, like, this is the story we're telling from the outset. We're not talking about like a dramatic decline where people are starving in the streets. We're talking about a marginal underperformance of the U.S. economy over a long period of time, leading to relative poverty.
Right.
So it's
Slow decay.
Yeah, it's a decay story. You might as well be talking about like an 80-year-old's teeth.
Now, let's see. How can I do this? Here we go.
Sorry, gents. That is my time.
It's your time to go. All right. Thanks, Madmer.
Pleasure to be on.
Okay, so Mickey has a couple super chats. One suggests that we show a chart, which I have pulled down, and we'll see if you find it interesting to comment on it. Let me just sec to get that on the screen. There we go. Okay, there's a chart nicely accompanying the European decline that he sent to me. It shows how it is deliberate industrial destruction. He's jumping ahead of our story a little bit, but that's okay. So this is showing natural gas production in the European Union.
Yep.
And we see a long run decline over the last 10 years. And it's pretty dramatic decline, it seems to me. That's a cut in half, right? Over 10 years?
Yeah, a little bit more than that.
More than that. Yeah. So this is quite big. And it looks like it's primarily the Netherlands. I guess that's why you're always showing us the Dutch natural gas price, right?
Yes.
The Dutch are heavy in this. Yeah, in fact, the others, okay, I do see some marginal shrinking, but it's primarily a Netherlands story, it looks like.
Yeah, so what you're looking at here is you could show a very large number of these charts that show the green policy of the European Union strangling these economies.
Yeah.
So, like, we showed the fact of the relative decline in real wages in these countries. There's a million different ways you could show the causes of that decline. It's the reason why I didn't show. I mean, we could sit here all day and look at various ways in which this kind of regulatory behemoth that is the European Union is kind of. I mean, they're managing to out-strangle the federal government in the U.S. If you can kind of imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of these people who are, splashing paint on paintings or whatever.
Yeah.
Vandalizing things in art museums and gluing themselves and stuff. I mean, this is the European Union just on the ground, right? I mean, it's the same orientation, which is to shut down industrial civilization, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and so this has been kind of a slow Python movement where, it's not the effect of this thing manifests over a long period of time in just decay in standards of living relative to the United States, where, Mr. Biden talks about how climate change is a really serious issue, but if we were to show natural gas production in the United States over the same period, you'll see a very substantial increase in production. If we were to show like electrical prices in the United States over the same period, in most places in the United States, electrical prices have not changed significantly over the last decades over the last decade in real dollars terms. Whereas in most of Europe, electrical prices have increased, by an order of magnitude at least over the last 15 years.
Right, and as we pointed out, that obviously has effects on regular folks, but also direct effects on household economy. But it also means that certain industries become unprofitable.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
If you shut down the aluminum industry because the electrical prices are too high, it's not like the Netherlands goes bankrupt overnight because you can't refine aluminum there anymore. But these things have a marginal effect that just causes people to be poorer.
Yeah.
And that's really the story that you can tell in Europe leading up to the Ukraine war, that that after an initial period of relative success between sort of 2003 and 2010, you have this in terms of economic trends, a fairly rapid decay of the standards of living of Europeans, especially in the peripheral countries, though noticeable in the core countries as well.
Right. Anyway, there'll be more on this. Another thing from, two things. This is not a super chat, but Mickey says 75% of the Greek population lives in 3 cities. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, well, it's why rioting's such a problem there.
Right. In those 3 cities, probably. And then another one from Mickey. Greek economy is totally wild. As of now, median pension is over 100% of the value of median wage.
Yeah. Even after the pension reforms, pensions in Greece are still substantially more generous than what you can get in the regular wage economy. Which, if you think about this in terms of incentives, this is just, it's insane. And it's exactly the opposite of what's happened in North America, where the incentives have driven workers who previously would have left the workforce at between age 60 and age 65 to work much longer. In a lot of the European economies, the incentives have aligned to keep these people out of the workforce, which, whatever you might think of the social implications of that, it's certainly bad for their economies. So, whereas in North America, we're very rapidly approaching like pre-Great Society retirement models where people, unless you work for the government, you basically don't retire. I mean, you can see this with all your friends and neighbors. Defined benefit pensions are basically not a thing anymore, unless you work for very particular elements of the government. So people who are working class in North America work until they're physically unable to work. This kind of social change has not occurred in Europe. And so they've paid for this in reduction in real earnings. You can have whatever opinion you want about which model is better, but there's definitely disparate consequences.
A Captain Smith in the live chat had some interesting stories to tell, but I just would highlight this one. He says, I remember the Greek debt crisis of 2015. I was on holiday there at the time. There's more details in the live chat, so that's entertaining. One more thing, very faithful supporter of the show, Sam153, gives a generous super chat and says, enjoy the vacation. Thanks for the great topics. Cheers. Thank you, Sam, for your support. Okay, so what I think you've carefully avoided, and I'm not bringing it up for you to talk about it, but just to say, there's more for us to do here. What you've carefully avoided is to talk about these developments in Europe, sort of like what's the root cause of them, right? Is the U.S. empire behind it, as some people would feel? Is it just poor bureaucratic management on the part of the European Union? You brought up the climate change stuff. Is it, I guess you could call environmentalist or left-wing environmentalist stuff starting to have an effect? And what does this all mean when we get to the war in the Ukraine, right?
Well, and part of the reason
it starts to feel, in light of what you've been showing us here, some of the U.S. forced sanctions basically start to feel like kicking a man when he's down,
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason we've studiously avoided them is there isn't a lot of historical distance between the events we're discussing and now. And so I highly suspect. So when you ask the question, is the European Union bureaucratically mismanaging the European economies because they're bad bureaucrats or because they're vassals of the United States? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. If they were doing it because they were vassals of the United States, it's not like they would tell you.
Yeah, right.
So, if you look at what we now know about the post-war activity of the CIA in Europe, as an example, it's very likely that there's a lot to this story behind the scenes. But what we can report on right now is the actual consequences on the ground, and we can point to some of the organizations that are clearly driving it. So we can point to the regulatory bodies of the European Union as a nexus from which this stagnation is being imposed, certainly. But it's why the European Union does what it does. Well, that's beyond my expertise.
All right. Well, I think that's all we're going to cover for today. As I said, I think there's more to say about what's been happening in Europe. This is focusing on a period that ended 8 years ago, right? That crisis in particular from 2010 to 2015. And we hinted at some things that happened after 2015, but didn't really go into depth. I remember that when we talked about the effects of the Ukraine war, we put a lot of stuff in context and showed, yes, there are some, declines in various areas, but a lot of those declines had been going on already and maybe just were accelerated. They got worse with the Ukraine war, but they were trends that were already in place, right?
Well, and if you look at like the decline in mean household incomes in Germany in the period we measured, so from 2010 to 2020, you're seeing like a decline in purchasing power in Germany equivalent to like 12 or 13% of like the mean household income of an American household. If you project that forward over 10 years, a 10% decline kind of hurts, but it's not that dramatic. The question is, how long does this go on before the forces that drive it are arrested? And what we've seen, particularly with the Ukraine war, is an accelerating trend rather than a decelerating trend. Yeah. So Europe still hasn't found its footing, which is why I think this should be of really substantial interest, because in some of these countries like Greece or Spain, you're rapidly approaching like third world levels of median household income, which is given where these countries were, in living memory, it's just disgusting is what it is.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and there's a reason we're doing this series, and part of it is that I'm I'm unhappy with what's happening in Europe. I don't think it had to be this way. I think people with names and addresses made choices that were, in some cases, incompetent, in some cases, evil, right?
Well, I mean, Spain is a great example where after the Franco regime was removed, I mean, you're now at a point where that line of thinking has been so repudiated that it's illegal to praise the Franco regime anywhere in Spain.
Wow.
You can be arrested for it. And the consequences of the choices that were made by the people who made the politics of Spain that way have been the substantial and continuous decline of living standards in Spain ever since they've been in power. So,
which, you know, they say things like, you know, it's the economy stupid and stuff like that, right? Well,
apparently not.
Yeah, the popular academic agent's populist delusion tells us that immiserating the population does not necessarily cause the population to rise up and do anything about it.
Well, I mean, there's been no political in the period between 2010 and we'll call it 2021 when the Ukraine war starts in Germany. There's been like enormous political stability, and at the same time, like a substantial relative decline in purchasing power for the average German, let alone whatever other social ills might exist in Germany. So it turns out that immiserating the population, even in a so-called democratic country, does not necessarily result in displacing your political coalition.
Yeah. So why not keep doing it, right? They don't get punished; they get praised for being politically enlightened or whatever.
Well, and that's what I say.
They care about the environment and blah blah blah.
When you discuss motives for this this kind of thing, like it becomes, you have to start looking at the incentive structure for the actors that actually made these decisions, and that's where it becomes quite complicated to see why those incentive structures exist. But certainly the incentive structure doesn't seem to be that you're rewarded for improving the economic life of your average citizen. You seem to be rewarded for immiserating them.
Right. And see Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, for a little bit of a framework that might help
yes,
to make sense of all this. Okay, I think we'll stop there. I believe I'm caught up on Super Chats. Thanks to those who chatted or tipped on Subscribestar. And thanks again to faithful subscribers on Subscribestar who support the show, usually around $5 a month. Though now I'm going to start, as we do this series, Black Horse, if anyone's supporting me from Europe, I'm going to feel more and more guilty.
Yes, okay.
I'll have to come and be a tourist and, live like a king with
drop off
US
some of those good old greenbacks there.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Black Horse. I'll just remind everyone, I take an annual vacation in the late summer. That time has come. So no shows or streams from my channel for the next 3 weeks. I'll be doing various fun things with my family, including one of the traditions of my people, floating down a river in a boat for all day long, which I'll be doing next week with some teens. So, okay. Thanks, everyone, and see you in about a month.